With the release of Invasion of Vengeance, the TCG now has access to 2 new archetypes. One of them, Chemicritters, seriously, why the name change from chemical beasts, either heralds the return and possible ascension of the Gemini mechanic, or the grinding of teeth, cursing the fact that these particular spots in the set were not used for more promising cards. It is not hard to imagine that at the current point in time, a sizable number of players are sliding into that latter position. However, is this feeling justified? Let's investigate with the deck build. Looking at the direct support first, Dioxogre is definitely one of the winners in the first batch of support. Its level 8 standing helps facilitate rank 8 XZ plays in cooperation with 2 other support cards, and its 2800 attack allows it to hit over a number of threats, or at least trade with them. Its Gemini effect is also nice quasi +1 generator, basically expanding future Samurai's effect from face-up monster to any opponent card at the cost of banishing a Gemini monster from the graveyard. Its no negation effect is rather unimpressive though, and probably will never be used. The one major drawback is it is a level 8, so it does need help to get onto the field without using tributes. However, critters need the power, and the level 8 standing, I run 2 copies. In contrast, Hydreigon is utterly horrible. In a meta where attacking is almost always better than defending, a card with Dioxin's reversed stats inherently struggles. Not only are the base stats of Hydreigon defensive, but also its primary effect is as well, protecting Gemini monsters in a 1-for-1 standing trade-off versus destroying the opponent's card. This protection effect might have been worth it if it were a free once-per-turn concept, rather than a substitute destruction effect. The sub-destruction effect is especially bad in this deck because it doesn't have any cards that want to be destroyed or receive significant benefit from being destroyed, and hybridizing with such a concept is too inefficient and complicated. The only reason anyone would really want to run this card is to pair it with Dioxogre, Burnout, for an easy rank 8 play, but even then, this card is just too inefficient for my tastes. 0 copies. Similar to his fully reacted brethren, Hydron Hawk is also depressingly bad. At 1400 attack, he cannot kill much, and his Gemini effect is rather forgettable. Discard 1 card to special summon 1 Gemini monster in defense position. This card may have been serviceable if the summons was player's choice or in attack position, but the defense position almost exclusively reserves the summons for extra deck plays. The discard is also meaningful because this deck does not produce a lot of pluses. Also, the summoned monster does not even receive its Gemini effect. Hawk's usefulness pales in comparison to pretty much all of the other level 2 Gemini monsters that exist, both in critter and non-critter form. Carbo Crab is a must in the deck as a walking Foolish Burial Gemini-based reinforcement of the army. Crab's effect is important in setting up your plays, both in the short and long term. Also as a level 2, it has a strong extra deck synergy with a lot of quality Gemini monster options, and its Aqua standing even allows it to pair up with another copy of itself to make a Tree Toad. 3 copies. Oxy Ox is another quality and critically important critter monster, with a very useful effect. The ability to not only net a free summons of a Gemini monster from the hand, making the normal summons of Ox for its secondary effect an actual 1-for-1 trade-off rather than a quasi-sunk cost, is nice enough alone. But the level manipulation opens the door to easy non-rank 2 plays, which helps maximize the efficiency of deck construction relative to versatility. A nice side benefit to Oxy Ox is its 2100 defense, which actually allows it to be set, survive opponent's next turn, and then Gemini summoned next turn to pull off its effect. 3 copies. Methydraco is a nice quality support card for Geminis as a 3000 attack monster that nets a free monster when XZ summoned, target and attack protection for Gemini monsters, and a material-based card or hand elimination. Thanks to Ox's level changing effect, getting it on the field is rather easy comparatively. However, due to extra deck space, I only run 1 copy. Burnout is hit or miss for me, for from the deck summoning is always useful. Attributing the single critter monster as the cost is almost immaterial because it can then later be recovered with Burnout's graveyard effect. The big advantage of this card is that it works as a quasi-catalyst field during your turn or your opponent's end phase. So what's the problem? One problem is it's a trap, so it requires a one-turn wait. Also, it's somewhat run counter to the secondary effect of Catalyst Field. There are only 5 critters, and 2 of them are low quality and should really not be run in your deck. Thus, making effective plays off of Burnout becomes more complicated than they should be, and there is a lack of versatility. Finally, the card is not searchable. If another good level 8 critter monster ever comes out, then Burnout only has to deal with the issue of being an unsearchable trap, which is definitely manageable. Burnout's graveyard effect is alright right now, but the number of options available to make quality use of it are on the light side. Ox and Gemini Solder are really the only 2 that see main deck play for me. Right now, I just do not think that Burnout does enough positive for the deck relative to some other choices you can make for the deck. The speed of the game at this point in time also does not help the playability of Burnout a lot. In my opinion, Burnout is sitting on that precipice in a sense. It's just waiting for another 1 or 2 good critter monsters, and then suddenly it goes from, yeah, I guess you could play that, to, you have to play it. Before moving on to the other monsters, clearly there is one particular card that, while not a direct critter support card, it might as well be. Catalyst Field is the only reason critters should ever get a look, for it is possibly the most important field spell in the game for its target archetype. It's more important than Union Hanger, it's more important than Cosmotown, it's more important than Necro Valley. Field actually gives Geminis the opportunity to be competitive. Its first effect is definitely quality, allowing the normal summons of a level 5 or higher Gemini monster without tribute, which means, hey, I can drop a 2800 attack point monster as a normal summons. That can do some damage, in addition to providing a second normal summons. If that were the effect alone, then this card would be worth running. But it has a very nice quasi +1 destruction based effect as well. Banish a monster with an active Gemini effect from your field to destroy the opponent's card, and the monster returns during your opponent's end phase. Catalyst Field, fantastic overall, especially when the game boils down to that grindy phase. Catalyst Field is the most important thing this deck can do to win. 3 copies. Now, there are a number of Gemini monsters, but most are not even worth the discussion, so I will only go over the more notable ones. Phoenix Gearfried has a solid 2800 attack, with a nice graveyard revival effect based on opponent spell card activation, although you don't see it as much as you would expect. The target negation effect is less impressive now than it was in the past, and the general cost of an equip is typically too much when Supervise is not involved. Fortunately, in Gemini decks, Supervise was almost always involved, and will be so if you choose to run that combination now. The main problem with Gearfried, I guess you could say it's a level 8, and it does need some help to be summoned. I like running 1 copy. I do not like Darkstorm Dragon in this deck, because the most important thing is making sure Catalyst Field is on the field and stays on the field. Darkstorm has 2700 attack, less than both Dioxin and Gearfried, and its Gemini effect is a heavy storm. Yeah, so you lose your Catalyst Field. That's not good at all. The fact that you have to send a face-up spell or trap on the field to the graveyard to activate the effect is also rather bad. I do not recommend running this card because it will almost always be more detrimental than beneficial. Red Eye's Archfiend of Lightning is an interesting card, for with its Gemini effect, basically a lightning vortex, opponent monsters with less than 2500 defense, which should ensnare a lot of monsters, but not a lot of the big fish. And with ABCs, Magispectors, and Blue Eyes as meaningful meta decks, Archfiend is better left for the side deck, if even that. Gigaplant is probably the most well-known and successful Gemini monster, but obviously does not fit in this particular deck. Heavy Knight of the Flame is definitely a quality Gemini card, and one that's kind of slipped through the cracks when people think about Geminis. It actually has an effect that makes sense for the cost of 2 summons, banishing any special summoned monster it attacked at the start of the damage step. Also, as a level 4 1800 attack monster, it is not a liability when it does not have its Gemini effect active. I like running 2 copies. Skelosaurus would be interesting if this deck had some routine or easy means to effectively reduce opponent attack power, or maybe even ran Lose One Turn or Book of Eclipse, because the biggest problem with this card in the past has always been you can't really search for it. With Crab, now you can. However, without an ability to put monsters in defense mode or lower their attack power, the 1700 attack is commonly not enough to be effective enough to net the big fish, so to speak. However, both Scalesaurus and Lose One Turn, or even Book of Eclipse, can be viewed as meaningful side deck cards if one wants to go that route. Blazewing Butterfly at 1 copy is an interesting tech choice for those who elect to run Supervise, for tributing it when equipped with Supervise nets 2 graveyard summons, with one of them, the one-off Butterfly, having its Gemini effect. Also, its combination with Catalyst Field allows almost an upgrade of Scent. You summon Butterfly, activate its Gemini effect, tribute it off, upgrade it to a 2800 attack level 8 from the graveyard with its Gemini effect active. However, despite these nice little benefits associated with Butterfly, I just don't find it efficient or useful enough in this particular deck. Gemini Solder is almost mandatory in my mind in any Gemini deck build, including Critters. The ability to special summon any level 4 or lower Gemini monster from the deck after damage calculation. A Gemini summoned Soldier can also be a rather annoying pest on the field for the opponent due to this ability to, oh, we engaged in battle? Well, you didn't destroy me, and I get to summon something else from the deck. So unless your opponent is flooding the field with monsters, it almost forces them, in a sense, to utilize a card effect to remove Soldier. I run 1 copy, though, because multiple copies can get a little dicey. Finally, while it's not a Gemini monster, Woodland Archer is the, I guess, archetype searcher, in a sense. A 1400 attacker that searches by tributing itself can get away with this somewhat annoying trait because it does have an innate special summoned ability. Unfortunately, the problem with this ability is it can be slow, commonly unable to special summon itself on the first turn or even the second turn due to the condition of having to have at least 2 Gemini monsters in the graveyard. With the first couple of turns being the most important in the game, especially for this deck, which is not overly as explosive as other archetypes can be, this typical wait to search for what you want off of Archer, it just takes too long for my taste. It's just not efficient enough. Also, none of the other non-Gemini Gemini support, in my opinion, is good enough to run in this deck. For the remaining monsters, I run 2 copies of Kozmoll Wickedwitch for field control purposes, as this deck can have some open fields, thanks to this using the secondary effect Catalyst Field, so you want to have stable monster that can actually hold the field, and 2 copies of Blackwing Gofu the Vague Shadow. I do not like running Gofu so much in non-Blackwing decks because it's one of those principal things. Gofu's a card that really shouldn't have been made so easily splashable, but it does provide some nice elements for this deck. As a level 5 tuner, it can be special summoned, innately setting up both level 7 and level 9 synchro plays. Also, the summon tokens can be utilized as defensive walls for stalling when needing to grab Catalytic Field, or for another purpose that will be discussed later. For the remaining spells, I run 3 copies of Terraforming. Catalyst Field is so important to this deck that Terraforming has to be at 3, despite any potential inefficiencies. 1 copy of Raigeki for field removal, as this deck can fall behind at times when going first. 1 copy of Upstart Goblin, and 3 copies of Pot of Duality for speed. I also run 3 copies of Messenger of Peace to slow down the game in order to increase Gemini summoning probability and amplify the usefulness of Catalyst Field secondary removal effect, because sometimes you don't want to leave an open field with the overall explosive level of this game without some form of protection, and Messenger of Peace actually does it fairly well. While the Gofu tokens cannot be tributed or used in synchro summons, they can be used in fusion summons. Thus, I like to run 3 copies of Dragon's Mirror to supplement First of the Dragons summoning. First is still a great card against almost everything in the meta right now that is not a Blue Eyes White Dragon deck. I find Dragon's Mirror to be more valuable than Polymerization in this particular build because of the fewer resources associated with its banishing ability. Now, some might say Mirror conflicts with the 1 copy of Tri-Wright I run, but with the number of level 2 monsters I run, the end result does not produce significant inefficiency or a negative interaction. Closing up the spells, I run 1 copy of Unleash Your Power, and no copies of Supervise. Basically, the breakdown between these 2 cards is that Unleash Your Power is superior when working with Catalyst Field. Due to the double summons ability, you can put 2 Geminis on the field instead of just the 1, then use Unleash Your Power. They both get their effects, whereas Supervise is superior for field control, fusion summoning, and in combination with Butterfly. Overall, I think Supervive provides a little more versatility than Unleash Your Power, but since this deck is basically made or broken by Catalyst Field presence, the overall usefulness of Unleash Your Power exceeds Supervise. Finally, for the traps, I run 1 copy of Solemn Warning, 1 copy of Vanity's Emptiness, and 3 copies of Quaking Mirror Force because you're going to have monsters in the field typically, and you want to protect them so then they can get their Gemini effects off during the next turn. For the extra deck, I run the 2 copies of First of the Dragons, 1 copy of Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, Vermillion Mech Dragon, 1 copy of Clearwing Synchro Dragon, 1 either Ancient Fairy Dragon or Ancient Pixie Dragon if your opponent does not use a field spell, Ancient Pixie Dragon. If your opponent's deck does use a field spell, Ancient Fairy Dragon. 1 number 95 Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon, 1 Galaxy Eyes Full Armor Photon Dragon, 1 number 38 Hope Harbinger Dragon Titanic Galaxy, 1 number 107 Galaxy Eyes Tachyon Dragon, 1 number 23 Lancelot Ghost Knight of the Underworld, 1 Castel Sky Blaster Musketeer, 1 Totally Awesome, and 1 Sky Cavalry Centuria. So, let's get right down to the brass tacks, so to speak. Is this deck competitive? The short answer is no. There are 2 ways to play this deck: explosive, and I use that term somewhat loosely, or control. Clearly, my build is more control-based because the problem I see with explosive builds is twofold. First, if you don't a Catalyst Field by turn 2, you basically lose. Second, the explosiveness of the explosive build is somewhat lackluster compared to the fields that other decks can spit out. This more control-based build at least produces the opportunity to compete without Catalyst Field on the field. Overall, it is very easy for this deck to get run over by the advantage commonly produced by most meta and quality rogue decks. For those interested, I have posted a version of a more, explosive build in the description. You can see there are certain differences between the two. Overall, the big problems with this deck are, right now it's too slow, it's too reliant on Catalyst Field. It's an issue that will probably never change. And while Crab, Ox, and Dioxin are definitely steps in the right direction, Gemini monsters still do not pack the level of punch they typically need to justify utilizing that second summon to gain their effect. Well, that is my critter deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.